was very pleasantly surprised a few weeks ago when Crossed Paths reached out to me about a preview of their upcoming game, Drakonym. If you haven't heard about it yet, it's a high fantasy RPG in which you play as riders who form bonds with dragons that grow and mature just as your characters develop. And this is all set in the world of Akaroth, the same universe as some of their other games like Bramble Trek. Just to be clear, that's the original Bramble Trek, not Adventures in the 100 Acre Woods, although there are woods in Akaroth that may or may not be 100 acres. Anyway, I was actually even more surprised that they had physical preview copies available already, and after we talked briefly about the planned solo guidebook that works as a standalone game and as an expansion, this is what I was expecting to receive. But surprising me once again, I actually got a lot more than that. And what I found inside is a game not just about riding dragons, but an expansive and open-ended game, a smooth transition from any games you might be used to, or a good option even if you're new to RPGs. It has big ambitions to be one of the contenders for that go-to game in this growing modern field of tabletop gaming that's occupied by what I've been calling collaborative games, like Fabio Ultima and Daggerheart. Now, before I get into this any further, I really want to stress that all this is very much a pre-alpha preview version of the game, not a finished product. It's a bit like what they call a vertical slice in the video game world, a representation of what the final product will look, feel and play like far before the game is properly ready for playtesting. So I'm going to try in this video to go through what the game looks, feels and plays like right now, not just the solo guide like I originally planned, but as much as I think might be helpful if you're considering backing the project. This might be a long video. So first, I want to put everything on the table, so to speak. So before we get into mechanics and gameplay, I'll show you everything that Crossed Paths sent me to represent what they have planned for the game, both books and extra accessories. We have 3 main hardbacks: the core rulebook, a GM or Herald's Guide, and a solo rulebook. And each is filled with beautiful and vibrant art and a classic layout. The core rulebook contains everything you need to play the game, while the Herald's Guide augments it with some advice for GMs and campaign seeds. But mostly it focuses on adding to the lore and setting of Akaroth, particularly the northwestern region of Batessian. The solo rulebook stands out to me as an interesting addition. It works as a standalone game, where you'll find the basic rules of the core book, but with its own classes and subclasses, random tables and location information. So that means you can actually use either book to expand the other, whether you're playing solo or with a group, which is quite neat. There's also an introductory adventure, Shadows over Verdemir, which looks like the kind of thing you might run at a convention. It assumes you're playing with pre-generated characters, presents the rules, and gives a simple and classic adventure to follow, with a hint at a larger world and story. Next, there's a GM screen that's high in both quality and height. If you're shorter in stature, you genuinely might have trouble seeing over this one. You won't really be doing much dice rolling as a GM in Drakonym though, but it works as a cheat sheet. Then we have sets of 120 spell cards, 2 varieties, regular and holographic. These are great, really nicely designed, colour-coded, with art that works like an instantly recognisable icon of the sort you might find in a computer RPG, and with simple side icons for things like casting cost and damage. And lastly, an absolutely beautiful dice set, heavy with a cracked glass effect. I'm not entirely sure what they're made of. They're a lot more dense than acrylic or resin sets, and the tin just says Mystery Gem Dice Set, contains 6d6s and 1d12, so I'm being careful what I roll these onto. And that's everything. And although there are plenty of text errors at the moment, it's all beautifully presented and overflowing with promise. Drakonym's Runebinder system takes a lot of positives from mechanics you're probably already familiar with. First, it uses a classic d6 dice pool for nearly all rolls. A 5 and a 6 counts as a success, and you need a certain number to pass the check. Tried, tested, simple, effective. You have 6 attributes: body, gods, mind, shadow, soul, and world, each with an associated number of d6s. You don't have a list of skills though. Instead, much like Ryotama or Fabula Ultima, you build a pool by combining 2 attributes depending on your approach. So a deception check might be a soul and shadow roll, and recalling information about minor spirits might be a gods and world roll. It really depends on the situation. I'm a big fan of systems like this. I find they lend themselves to more creative approaches than systems where sometimes every problem ends up looking like a nail to be hit with whatever your highest skill is. At this stage, you might be wondering what the D12 is for. Well, that's the shadow die. If you fail a check, you can give yourself another chance of passing by rolling a D12, but it comes at a cost. Depending on what you roll, the results can be catastrophic, and it gives the Herald shadow points that they can spend to intrude on the story with twists and complications. Combat works similarly, except that instead of 2 attributes, you're generally going to be rolling your primary attribute, which is whatever you selected at character creation, plus a bonus number of dice from your weapon or armor. A point to mention here is that this is a players always roll system. You roll to attack, roll to defend, to cast a spell, and so on. And there's clearly been some thought put into making combat accessible and flowy, while also keeping it tactical. For accessibility, you don't roll initiative. Instead, the players generally go first in whatever order they decide before the adversaries. For tactics, on your turn you have a 4 action point economy and a list of actions you can take and their cost. If you don't spend all of your AP, you retain them for the next round. For accessibility, there isn't a separate roll for attacking and damage. Instead, each success counts as a wound, and defense rolls reduce incoming damage using a threshold system similar to Daggerheart. And then again for tactics, you have pools of mana and grit to spend on spells and special abilities, and each class has unique mechanics to regenerate them in combat. One more mechanic I want to mention before moving on to the gameplay and dragons is a really fun spell customization system. There are no spell levels, and a level 1 caster can choose their domains and pick any 2 spells they like. You can then customize your spell in all kinds of ways, just by adding to its cost. It can be as simple as boosting its power, or as crunchy as setting it to go off for 2 consecutive rounds in a 3-square aura when a certain trigger condition has been met. You can either build your own spellbook for your custom spells, or change it in the moment as you're casting. It's a super fun and simple system, and can be as in-depth as you want it to be. Following on from all the accessibility talk, onboarding is clearly another thing that the designer has thought about. How do you provide simple options for newcomers to choose from, while keeping depth of customization for veterans? Well, here's one way. You have a good number of typical fantasy ancestries, from elves to, shall we say, more niche but marketable options. And of course the Norborn from Bramble Trekker here too. Then you have 4 familiar base classes in the core book, each with a difficulty rating. That might sound like a small number at first, except that you choose any one of your attributes to be your primary, and spellcasters choose any 2 schools of magic and can pick any spell from those lists. So already you can build a beefy mage that casts spells with their muscles if you want. And then at level 3, you choose any one of 20 subclasses, which is really a hidden multiclass, adding far more depth. Your muscle mage can now have guns for their guns. And yet, it's still not overwhelming for newcomers. They still have a simple list of options to pick from, each with a difficulty rating again. Now, backgrounds are interesting in Drakonym, and maybe background isn't the right word for them because they develop as you level, following a tree system. It's almost like classes are your combat specialism and backgrounds are your social specialism. Now, after assigning your attributes and choosing some gear, there's potentially one more thing to do: build your dragon. The game suggests that you start with a dragon egg or hatchling, although you could instead discover your dragon and form this bond in the first few sessions, which is how the intro adventure handles it. Now, everything I've said so far could be about a generic high fantasy game with any setting, but here I'm going to need to get into the lore of Akaroth. Your dragon is not just a mount, and it very specifically isn't a combat tool. Your dragon is a mystical and noble creature with its own personality that evolves from your interactions with the world. The world of Akaroth is still reeling from the primal destructive power of dragons. Their wars devastated nations and felled mountains. For a short time, dragons chose riders until Dragonfall, when, for unknown reasons, the dragons turned on their riders and each other in a cacophony of destruction. The few remaining dragons were bound by a divine oath to never again take part in the wars of mortals. Dragons have since been incredibly rare, but are starting to choose riders again. So, your dragon cannot directly aid you in combat, at least not without serious consequences. You have a far more mystical bond with them that's mostly narrative. You choose one of 8 aspects for your dragon that informs your dragon's initial temperament and abilities, from the contemplative astral dragons to the mischievous mirrors and stoic sun dragons. At significant emotional stages, they might also gain a heart, which is a driving motivation, and then you can define their pillars, the emotional core of your bond. As you play, you'll be tracking that bond, and acting in accordance with your dragon's identity lets it grow closer with you and evolve into a more powerful form, while acting against that identity sows discord. So really, your dragon is part of your character representing their ideals and inner conflict. It's very similar in concept to one of the inspirations for the game, Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive series, where a character's growth in power is tied to their ideals and bonds represented by a companion character. While the base game is open-ended and can accommodate all kinds of stories, the solo mode focuses in on a journey across Batessian using some hex crawl elements. The map is overlaid with hexes, and for each one you pass through, you roll 2 daytime encounters and 1 nighttime encounter, depending on the terrain, using an array of tables and oracles. In addition, you keep track of resources using a clock. There's the beginnings of a plot tracking system and a way of rolling up combat encounters without stat blocks. There are some great info pages too about the canonical locations of Batessian, and in between those marked hexes, you'll be generating your own settlements. It also turns the shadow die into a curse that steadily gets worse the more shadow points it generates. So mechanics-wise, the solo book adds 2 new classes, 2 subclasses, a background, a travel system, random tables, and a few different encounter systems. Those are great expansions to the base game, but honestly, bolt-on rules aren't quite what I'm looking for in a solo mode. I'd rather play the base game with its open-endedness, and instead of a hex crawl, I'd rather have more tools for generating and tracking plot threads, introducing narrative twists and setting difficulty. And I think that leads me on to the next section. Despite its appearances, Drakonym is very much in early stages of development. There's a lot of fun to be had with it already, but plenty that I hope and expect will change. I'm sure there'll be mechanical changes from playtesting, like the rules for dragons, which Crosspaths has made a core selling point for the game and its world, but currently feel a little tacked on to a more generic system. And I certainly hope the lore content will be properly edited to remove what feels like placeholder text that's disjointed and contradictory, where different sections often read like they're describing different worlds. Akaroth as a world is a bit unfocused and has signs of scope creep, but I will say that I'll be eagerly following Drakonym's development, and I hope Crosspaths can polish the lore consistency and tie Drakonym's mechanics together in playtesting. I'm really excited to see where this goes. There's a lot of potential here, and if you've followed my reviews, you'll probably see why this project ticks a lot of boxes for me. I'm thrilled to see one of these big open-ended games launch with a solo mode, and I really hope those solo rules get a bit more development to give them the same onboarding treatment, and to make a solo game feel more like the base game. Drakonym is an ambitious game, and it knows it. It's aiming at a place in the market right now that needs delicate balancing. It sets its sights on the sweet spot between an accessible system and standout mechanics, between narrative flow and tactical crunch, between easy onboarding and depth of customization, and between being that go-to high fantasy adventure game and having a unique and compelling theme: dragon bonding. And if there was ever a time that a game like Drakonym can succeed, it's right now. We've had big crowdfunding success stories in this space, like Daggerheart and the Stormlight RPG. But those games had a fan base already eager to throw money at them. So, if you are interested in either of those games, you might want to give Drakonym a chance too. And if you're the kind of player that wants a rich and vibrant narrative game while also enjoying classic RPG elements like character builds and combat, you are who Drakonym is pitching at. It's also a mammoth undertaking, designed mostly by one person, A.R. Swain, who I suspect has been thinking about Drakonym for a long time. In their introduction at the front of the book, they say they've always dreamed of building an expansive RPG to hold the world of Akaroth, and after the successes and lessons of their previous games, they explain, "This is my flagship, my love letter to a genre I owe everything to." And to me, that sums up Drakonym perfectly. Thank you ever so much for watching. I won't keep you with a long outro, but I will say a massive, massive thank you to this month's Ko-fi supporters for their kindness. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to discover a new game every couple of weeks. And until next time, happy adventures.